So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Thoughts on Purpose podcast. My name is Nash Mackey, and we're here today with the amazing Isabella Imani. Isabella is a relationship and behavioural coach, and Isabella supports people reprogram their subconscious behavioural patterns through inner alignment and goal setting. Isabella, thank you so much for joining us for the Thoughts on Purpose podcast today.
Yes, thank you so much for having me.
Absolute pleasure. Absolute pleasure. I'm really so excited for this conversation. I mentioned to a few people I am supporting that I was interviewing you, and I had a lot of people say, "Oh my goodness, I was so excited for this conversation, for it to come up on the podcast," because you made a great impact on a lot of people I know recently. We were both part of an academy, and you spoke and you touched people profoundly. And so I'm excited to be here today.
Thank you. I am as well. So I'll follow your lead.
Awesome. So I like to start the conversations with a bit of a different question than some people might ask. I'd love for you to imagine, Isabella, that you were walking along a beach, your favorite beach, and you saw a young girl sitting on the beach, 7 years old. In fact, it was the 7-year-old version of you.
Mm-hmm.
And she saw you walking up toward her as the incredible, powerful, strong woman you are today. What do you think would inspire that 7-year-old version of Isabella the most about who you are today?
First off, that is such a beautiful question. I do a lot of inner child work with my clients. So a lot of the way that I work with my clients is a lot of like practical psychology paired with like holistic coaching. Mm-hmm. So just to hear that, I kind of went back to what my 7-year-old self was, or who she was. And it's interesting because I had this conversation with a friend not too long ago in terms of like inner child work and just knowing who I was. I was actually talking about when I was 8 years old. And a lot of who I was at 8 years old has been exactly who I am now, slightly more polished, but like the core values have always been the same. And I remember where I was when I was 8 years old and dealing with so much inner turbulence and external turbulence in terms of like poverty and, like even like sexual abuse and just a lot of really heavy things that were happening in that time in my life. But I remembered thinking to myself that I was going to make something of myself and that I was going to transform all of this pain into healing the world. And that was a big promise that I made to myself when I was younger. So my younger self, who would then witness who I am now, I think that she would be really inspired by knowing that we are giving ourselves the life that we promised we would. And it's not just for ourselves, but for others. So I don't know if that was a helpful answer.
That's the perfect answer. That's the perfect answer. I love that. And how incredible that you had that at 8 years old, like that would be your mission.
Yeah, I've always had, so I'm very spiritual. I'm not religious. And that's important to me. But I've always had this connection to a higher power. And we can call that power, that energy source in my mind, God, sure. But it's not a person, place, or a thing. It's really just this energy. But what is at the heart of that energy is the values that matter the most to me. And it's all of the best values of all of the religions out there, which is, do good, be good, do no harm, like love yourself, love others. And so I think actually I found God in the darkest moments when I was a little girl. So when I was experiencing all of that abuse, I remembered going in, there was a specific moment right around the age of 7, actually, where I remembered looking at myself in the mirror. And that's when this voice came into my head that said, Isabella, we're going to transform this pain into healing and growth for everyone. And that's in that moment when I found this God that has then protected me throughout my entire life, my entire career, which certainly is what brings us here today.
Wow, how incredible. How incredible. So had you grown up in religion, or like where did this voice come from, do you think?
No, it's wild. So I'm Thai and French. And so my mother, who immigrated here from Thailand, and I was born in New York. But when she immigrated here, we went to temple every now and then, but it wasn't a huge staple in my life. And where this voice came from, I'm truly not sure. But it's this voice that I actually have such a connection with till this day. This voice is with me in my morning rituals, when I say like my gratitude exercises, when I'm making major decisions or even minor ones. And it was just this kind of North Star for me. Have you read the book, Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl?
Yes.
Powerful, right? So for anyone who doesn't know, Viktor Frankl is a famous, I think, psychologist, also Holocaust survivor. And in summary, the book talks about his experience and how basically in Man's Search for Meaning, it is our purpose that drives us to do everything that we do. And our purpose is something that isn't always going to be like inherently obvious to us, but it's certainly something that molds over time, and it's just something that calls out to our soul. And I'm just so grateful that, you know, I was able to feel out essentially what that is at an early age. And it, you know, just like everyone else, right, you know, figuring out their early 20s, early 30s, like, what is my purpose, what is my thing? I had always known that I had a passion for people, but I didn't know that it would fully align until a year and a half ago when I started my business.
Okay, so it wasn't a linear process. It was like, that's it, and how do I get there? It's like the zigzag.
The zigzags and like everything else in between. It was like I wrote a section in this book that I'm writing, and basically I described my early 20s as trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. So that's way to describe it. And then you kind of just, one day when you're doing the inner work, everything just clicks. So that's kind of where we are now, and grateful for my 7-year-old self for going through everything she went through, and here we are today.
Amazing. And I'm so inspired by the fact that you've turned that pain into something so great, and you're now supporting people, you know, in such a profound way. So I just want to acknowledge you for that. Amazing. So let's talk about inner alignment.
Yeah.
So for someone who feels that they can barely, like they can hardly bear to face another day.
Yeah.
How can the idea or the concept of getting into inner alignment, how can that be a remedy for people?
That's a great question. So for those listeners that aren't aware, and Nash, you've talked about this before. So I'm actually in the process of creating a book. And the cool thing about it is it's not your everyday book. It's actually, I'm calling it the Resiliency Planner. So it's exactly what that is. It's a planner, right? Because I want to make mental and emotional wellness a daily integrative practice of our life. And I think that, you know, and Nash, you are so great at personal development and doing all of the inner work in terms of how you're transforming the lives of your clients. So I know that you'll appreciate this as well. But like when it comes to the inner work, it's not just something that takes place in a moment, right? It doesn't just take place over 6 months of really intense therapy and like a Burning Man retreat, right? Like it's an ongoing thing if you're really committed to the process. In the first section of the inner alignment portion of this book, I basically give you like a mini PhD in like 20 pages or less. So I take you through what I call the inner alignment process that I go through with my clients, where we go through like the wheel of life and we figure out what your level of satisfaction is in terms of, you know, like your physical appearance and health, right? Your emotional like satisfaction, time, career. So we go up kind of the wheel of life and we figure out, you know, your level of satisfaction, right? So you rate yourself on a 10-point scale. And that's essentially the start of the inner alignment process. Because in order for us to grow, we must first bring into awareness where we currently are. So that's kind of our benchmark, right? So anyone who's feeling stuck, certainly take inventory of where you are now, because that's going to give us a great starting point to determine where we want to be. And so it all starts with self-awareness. The healing process all starts with self-awareness. And so then what we do from there is we transform that energy, that pain, into something greater. There's a really good quote. I'm not sure if you've seen it, but it basically goes, "You are not discouraged because of what other people are doing. You are discouraged because you are not aligned with yourself." And if you think about that quote, think of areas where you might still feel triggered, right? Or you might still feel, I'll give you an example. So I'm working with someone right now where they just started dating. This is the relationship part of my career. And they just started dating and everything. And I've been with them for the last year. So their dating journey. In the past, you know, when they're happy with their career, they're maintaining their resiliency rituals, which is like the meditation exercise and things like that. When they're on track, they are so unbothered by the little nuances of life. Like someone could hit their car in traffic or what have you, and they're just like, they go through the motions, but it doesn't tear them apart, right? Because they are so aligned with themselves, with their values, with their purpose. They're making sure that they get their needs met. So going back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? And then because of the course of our journey, I've seen them get misaligned or unaligned before, right? So kind of out of alignment.
Mm-hmm.
And then that's when the real challenges start. Because when you're out of alignment, you're so easily triggered, you can be bothered. And that's why the consistency is important. So it's first starting out by understanding like your level of satisfaction in life, where you currently are, and then where you want to be. And then just like almost like going into a doctor for like a physical alignment, we bring you back emotionally and spiritually back to those goals that you said you wanted to be on. And the rest is mindset and consistency.
That was beautifully explained. And for everyone who didn't hear the conversation we had before this call, one thing I love about what you do, Isabella, is your ability to simplify complexity and communicate very high level ideas in very easy to digest ways. And you shared frameworks on a call we were on previously. And I know your book's going to be packed with these amazing frameworks. So I'm excited to read that book. I really am. That sounds phenomenal. Amazing. So I've got so many questions I want to ask you, Isabella. I really do. Like as I delved into your world and into your work and remembered what you touched on in a previous call, I was like, which way do I go in this conversation? So I've sort of just gone from the heart here.
That's the best place to go.
It is. I would agree with that.
I love that you're doing that.
Awesome. So let's talk about, because I saw this on your Instagram page, you were talking about shifting from the identity that you developed as a younger person in order to feel loved. Because I know a lot of adults are, as I say, deteriorated children or wounded children still walking around. How do we actually make that shift? It probably goes in line with what you just touched on.
Yeah. So going back to what I said before, in terms of the way that I work with my clients, it's a lot of practical psychology paired with holistic coaching. And what that means is, I go very in depth though. So even in this book that I'm producing, it's 400 unique exercises referencing 400 psychological studies and theories.
Wow.
So it's heavily, but it's so beautifully summarized. It's like way sexier than it sounds, I promise.
I believe it.
So a part of actually the beginning of the book starts around the inner child work and reparenting. And so going back to kind of the things that we talked about. So we all deal in one capacity or another. We all have different levels of trauma. And I hate using that word sometimes because it's such a big, powerful word that I think there's not enough education around in terms of context. But the way that I describe it is there's big T trauma, such as, like sexual abuse or physical abuse, right? Or poverty. And then there could be little T trauma, which doesn't take away from like the severity of it, but it certainly like adds a different element of certain levels. So there's such as a breakup, right? So like that could be something that's traumatizing, something like bullying, right? And so if you think about humans and our lifespan, no one goes through life completely unscathed, right? And so going through this process with a trauma-informed approach is really helpful. So what that means is understanding everyone has trauma and leading with compassion, building safety, nurturing growth, and supporting that to the best of our ability. And that's the way that I work with my clients. Mm-hmm. And so when we're going through the inner child process of really healing from wounds from childhood or even adulthood, simultaneously, when I'm working with my clients, we go through what we call a reparenting process. So essentially, you're being the parent that you wish you had when you were younger, in all of the best ways, but you can do that for yourself. And what that looks like is setting healthy boundaries, loving yourself, telling yourself you did a good job, saying, Nash, you put in so much work today. You worked 60 hours. Your clients are like riding this wave. You've changed so many lives, but boy, oh boy, it's been 60 hours. Nash, tell yourself, I did a good job today and I'm going to go take a break because I've earned it, like, or just like little things like that. That's a part of the reparenting process. And that's how you simultaneously heal from your inner child wounds that translate into wounded adult wounds, or wait, that was redundant, wounded adult energy, I should say, if we don't bridge the gap between the two. So it's really starting with that self-love. And I think even, and I don't know about you and your work, so I'd love to hear kind of your side of it, but even the phrase self-love has been, I think, thrown around so often that sometimes people are like, well, what does that mean? And prior to doing this work, I was like, oh, like that sounds cute and all, but like whatever, and just kind of just emotionally bypassed a lot of the inner work. And so it's almost just like attaching to a greater meaning of personal development, personal growth, inner healing, and doing all the things that align with just that.
Yes, I love that. I love that. So self-love now for you, Isabella, what you've spoken about is really your definition of self-love. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, it's a lot of elements, but like certainly just generally speaking, everything that I just spoke about are different forms of self-love.
Okay.
So it could be the inner child healing. It could be the reparenting process. It could be taking a break. It could be eating ice cream because you freaking feel like it. Like these are all different forms of self-love, but understanding how to set healthy boundaries with yourself and support yourself. That's certainly just, I think, a quick and easy summary of what self-love is. Just really honoring where you are in life and how to best support yourself in ways that are helpful and not harmful.
Yeah, and I love the mentality of approaching yourself as a parent. Like, how would you approach a kid you were proud of? Like, you would acknowledge their effort, you'd reward the behavior, you would reward the effort. So
so I think something, because I mean, and I used to be in the corporate world, as many of us are or used to be, right? Where I remembered working, I was head of HR and operations prior to taking this role, and I was working like 60 to 70 hours a week. It was intense. And I remembered shaming myself so badly because I didn't get the 100 like bullet point list of things I wanted to get done in a day. And then I remembered thinking, if I were my 5-year-old self, would I tell myself that I weren't good enough because I didn't accomplish everything that I wanted to on a list? Would I yell at myself and make myself feel absolutely awful because my self-worth was magically somehow tied to my level of production? Absolutely not. And so it's that voice in our head that keeps like that. We just need to question the voice in our head, the negative thoughts and the negative thoughts, and certainly just judgments that we cast onto ourselves first. Understand where that voice came from and then push back and then just say, nope, I'm going to choose differently. And that's the beginning too of the reparenting process.
Yes.
Yeah.
I love that. I love that. And like, to that point, Isabella, I guess there's that situation where as a child, we might have had a parent who was very dominating, and they were like, you've got to get this done. You got to push through your homework. You got to grind. You got to hustle. And I think it's important as adults to actually just remind ourselves that we are not that child anymore, and actually say that, like that phrase, that's not me anymore.
Yeah.
Just creates that distance, and know that as an adult now, you've got a voice. You got a big girl voice. You got a big boy voice. You can use that.
How exciting to think too that in this lifetime we truly can be anyone we want to be and do anything we want to do. If we just changed our mindset and started believing in ourselves, literally, like, the world is ours. And that's kind of what when I go through an inner alignment process with my clients, something that is crucial is I don't teach you what to think. I just teach you how to think. So when we go through kind of the different stages of life mastery, where we talk about like, what does physical success look like to you? What does emotional success look like to you? I don't tell you any of those things. I do not redefine what that looks like. You decide what is good enough for you, and we work towards that.
I love that.
There's no expectation of what we should be doing, who we should be, even what career success looks like. If you are happy making 40 grand, 100 grand, $100 million, whatever your goals are, like, you define on life on your terms, because that is the only way you're going to be happy.
So, yes, I agree. And there's a truth inside each one of us that's unique. And when we ignore that, we suffer. We really do.
Yeah, agreed.
Beautiful, beautiful. What's the biggest fear you see in the people who you support? Is there a one fear that you'd say plays out more than others?
It's interesting. So we were talking about this a little bit earlier. The clients that I support right now, and I'm gender neutral, so I certainly like geared towards men and women, all types, doesn't matter. But I'm actually currently working with mostly all men, and all of the clients that I have, they're either CEOs of major Fortune 500 companies or executives of these companies as well. So it's really interesting working with that clientele group, because even when we think of success as reaching like that $100 million salary or what have you, no matter what your salary is, your level of like wealth, your social status, I feel like, the biggest fears that play across the board for all of us almost universally is like that fear of unworthiness, right? And so it's just constantly seeking this, that we won't be accepted. And I'm sure you've heard this before. Tony Robbins actually talks about it. He says that our biggest fears is that we won't be loved, and that we aren't good enough. And I think that actually stays true to no matter what your background is or level of perceived success is. And I think that's something that we're working through right now. There's a client of mine that I'm working with. He's phenomenal. He's incredible, just the kindest heart. And it's incredible to see, even with all of his beautiful, one-of-a-kind accomplishments, how he still feels this level of inadequacy. He's like, Isabella, I got to keep pushing. I like, that goal happened last week. It happened in my mind 2 years ago. He's like, I already made it. I already did it. And I'm like, well, hey, let's wait a minute. Let's pause. Let's reflect. Let's celebrate the little wins, right? Let's do the reparenting thing where we like acknowledge ourselves for how much we've given ourselves, right? Like let's do that. And it's a lot of peeling back layers to finally fully accept ourselves. And so with that, it's a lot of the inadequacy that we're working through. Fear that we're not good enough, fear that our family will not accept us, that they won't be proud of us. So that's a lot of it.
Yeah.
And understanding where that fear is rooted in, right? And so we do a lot of the early childhood development work where we understand like different areas of your life where you were impacted at age 15 and what that means. And it's a lot of cool stuff.
Yeah. It is super, super cool stuff and super transformational. So I love hearing about everything you're doing. Again, my background, for anyone who doesn't know, was medical for some years, and just saw so much wasted potential. So many people who felt helpless, like as they say, the learned helplessness that we can all fall into if we're not living on purpose or deliberately. So I love that you're out there supporting people, and like especially people at high levels as well with these companies. I think this is really amazing because in order to build a business or run a company like that, they have to be so service orientated. And sometimes I think a lot of people at a high level, at least who I've spoken with, they're a little bit scared to get rid of the thing that's causing them to have so much drive. Have you found that as well? Like they're like, I'm scared of taking away the thing that's been fueling this.
Yeah,
have you noticed that?
There's a lot of resistance, let me tell you. And at the end of the day, I mean, there are certain clients that, we've decided to part ways because that's a big decision that you have to make on your own, that you have to be ready for. So there have been a couple instances, not very many, where we've gotten to a point of the most depth that they've ever gone through, but it's like to reach that little thing that still irks them, but also helps them to thrive. You have to be at a place when you're ready to let those things go. And I think with the client that I just referenced, we're still doing so much inner work around that in terms of vulnerability and being able to be seen and heard. And he's like, Bella, like I've, like this is what got me here. And so it's a constant back and forth. But I think when there's a really good quote, I live my life by quotes, by the way.
I love
I'm like
it.
the biggest person ever. But it's something like, when the student is ready, or like jump in the net will appear or something, right?
Yes.
And I truly believe that that's how the universe works. And maybe the net isn't what we want the net to be, right? Maybe it's a different kind of net that the universe is delivering to us for our greater good. But whatever that may be, I think when you're ready to start doing the inner work and alleviating the pain and all of that, there will be something there to support you. It may not always be in the capacity that you want it to be, but I promise that like everything has your back. And when you're optimistic, and it's not just it's not like the dismissive positivity, which I'm sure you've heard before, where it almost invalidates like reality, but it's just having that optimistic perspective, because what's the alternative, right? Having a negative perspective. So you decide what energy you want to put out there, because whatever energy you're putting out there, you're surely to get back. So
Yes.
yeah.
Game-changing mentality. Just that in itself, like just saying, okay, what I put out, I get back. And I think that is enough for so many people to make a shift. That was a huge thing in my life when I was like, okay, wow, like that's real. When I heard a speaker once talk about that, I was like, okay, I'm going to be really careful what I do from now on. It makes sense. And when you have that awareness, you're like, okay, this is real. Maybe I'm actually responsible for more than I realize, and maybe I'm more powerful than I've realized up until this point. That was my experience.
Can I ask you a question?
Please.
So with your incredible military background, I'm sure you practiced a lot of stoicism. Is that a fair assessment? I think about, I've never been in that environment, so I'm just kind of going off of general knowledge, but I could be wrong. So with the stoicism, because I imagine that was a skill set you actually had to develop, and probably develop pretty quickly and pretty well in order to thrive in such a harsh environment. Is that fair?
It is, and I never pretend I went to war or anything. I did a lot of training with the military, obviously, but for sure, like I was a soldier, and so I had to learn how to, like you have to be incredibly regimented in what you do. And I'm probably more stoic now. Like the other day, I did a recording. I called it my 48-hour reset, where I was literally sleeping on my garage floor on a mat. Wake up at 3 a.m. and just pushing. I recorded it as a vlog, just to show people the importance of stepping outside of what's, or at least for me, I'd love your opinion on this. Stepping outside of what's familiar and also what's overly comfortable, so you actually tap into something deeper. Because like I say to people, you don't really know how fast you can sprint until you get out on the track and you give yourself permission to sprint.
Exactly.
So I love doing these things where these little blocks of time, you put yourself in a really uncomfortable situation and you just tap into something deeper. Do you believe that's healthy?
I believe it's healthy if it's managed, right? So little things like that. I had a question the other day where someone was like, we were talking about Michael Jordan and that Netflix special or something. And I was talking to a friend and he goes, and I actually don't know if this is true or not, but he asked me a similar question. And he was like, because we were talking about stoicism, and like, I love David Goggins. I'm sure you know Goggins. He's amazing, right?
Of course. Yes.
He's like the definition of like pure stoicism. But like that works for him. And basically my friend was like, Belle, do you think that it's because and I don't know if this is valid or not, but basically the question is for Michael Jordan to be Michael Jordan, the greatest of all time, he basically said that, he had to create all of these fictitious enemies in his mind to like fuel him being better and leveling up. And whether that's true or not, the question was, do you think that's healthy? And I said, and everyone's, I'm sure, got their own take on this, but I said, if it's not maladaptive and you can control it, then I think that that's fine. I think that like we all create these narratives in our mind, whether we know it or not, in order to thrive in certain environments. I know, you and I had that call before, and I told you, oh my goodness, I was so nervous before that call. And the reality is I actually had to create a narrative in my mind. And I think I said it on that call where I sat down, I did a visualization exercise. I was like, Isabella, you're a full badass. Like, you got this. And I almost had to like step into this narrative of like, who it is I wanted to be, this superpower or whatever. And that helped. Right. And so I think as long as the narratives that we tell ourselves, whether they're positive or there's a slight question mark in there, and I just want to be mindful of the way that I frame that, as long as it's not maladaptive. And what I mean by that is as long as it's not harmful to ourselves or others, and we have a fine grasp on that, I think that's totally fine. But I think a word of caution is that it is important to be mindful of how you manage those narratives.
Yes, absolutely. And like, I love everything you've just said there. Checking in with the place you're coming from. Like, even with my practices, it was like, why am I doing this? What's the intention? What place am I coming from when I do this?
Yeah.
And really what you're speaking to there, Isabella, is a word I love, self-governance, where you're like, you're like, okay, this is good for me to do this, but you're like, with the call for you, you're like, this is going to move me ahead. It's going to allow me to serve. And then you tell yourself that narrative that allows you to show up with the right energy. Like, in
Yeah.
that moment, you're self-governing. And I think that's just such a great skill that we can all develop. So it's amazing.
I agree. Actually, so going back to my original question for you around stoicism, obviously with that, I think there's varying different degrees of stoicism, right? And going back to self-governance, your word that you so beautifully mentioned, right? Like, I think even something like stoicism, if it's not managed in a healthy way, it could potentially become more maladaptive. Is that maybe a fair statement to say?
It
And
is.
what I love about kind of your energy, and I know we're still getting to know each other, but what I do love about your energy is that you also lead with really warm energy. It's very balanced, masculine and feminine energies. So my question around that is, given your previous line of work to where you are now, being a heart-centered transformational coach that changes lives, you cannot do that without vulnerability, right? Like,
Mhm.
and that's where you've been able to be as successful as you have been in your personal life and your life with your clients. How are you able to find that balance between stoicism and vulnerability and openness?
Yeah, it's such a great question. Thank you for asking it. Well, I think it came down to a place of, I saw that it was not working just one way. Like, I was relentlessly. I went from the military to then running my own construction business, and we had kids, and I had so much happening, and I was working 22-hour days on my construction business, sleeping 3 hours, pumping myself full of coffee, sugar syrup, working all day on my construction business. And I was just doing this day and day. And if I would
Yeah.
take a couple of days off, Isabella, I would crash. I would be in bed because my body was not used to
Oh
stopping.
yeah, I
So
remember.
yeah, okay, there you go. So, like, it came from a place of desperation. I was like, this does not work. This does not work. Like, I'm a relentless, like, I've got a relentless work ethic, but I
Yeah.
know that's not sustainable. Like, I look at David Goggins, I'm like, how does this guy do it? Like, how does he not switch off? But then you kind of look at his content creation, and he's creating as well, which is probably more of a flowy thing to some degree.
Yeah.
And he's obviously got the cameras on him, and he doesn't need that, but I'm sure he's got his ways of balancing as well. But like, yeah, so to answer your question, it came from a place of desperation and seeing that if you're too much one way, it does not work.
Yeah.
And I was just inspired to step into this work, and I knew I had to become a new expression of myself. So
That's beautiful. Do you feel like stoicism was also a way of potentially being guarded, like for you, in order to thrive in those environments?
absolutely. Oh,
Yeah.
for sure. For
It's
sure.
really interesting how when we start to do the inner work and we start to peel back those layers, what should feel healthy and should feel right sometimes feels the exact opposite. It feels unhealthy, it feels wrong, it feels lazy, it feels whatever. It's funny because when you're just describing basically your 22-hour days with your construction site, pumping all this coffee, working, that is such a normal, more or less normalized response to almost the entire population's reality, right? I remembered waking up at 4 a.m, stressing myself out, like 6 things of coffee. Like, I love Nespresso, so I was just downing my Nespressos, and then my diet was like, it was like all over the place, and not in terms of even dieting, but just like my nutrition. And it started to take a wear and tear on my body. And it's fascinating to me, kind of the line between like stoicism and like self-abandonment. Another thing that we go through when we talk about the reparenting process, right? Like, when is enough enough? And like, when is it okay to give yourself permission to take rest days and to be vulnerable and to ask for help, or to do nothing without calling yourself like lazy, or the guilt and the shame? It's just kind of rewriting our paradigms of what we think life should be. And that's kind of like the inner work that I do with my clients, even, where it's like, let's like disrupt almost everything you believe and question like where all those beliefs came from. Almost like if we took like a puzzle box and we just shook up all the pieces and we laid them all out and we just started piecing you back together in a way that made sense. But it's those delicate balances between stoicism, vulnerability, self-abandonment, self-awareness, like all the things.
Yes, I love that conversation, and I can definitely say that so much of the drive I had when I was younger for a lot of my life was from a feeling of not being good enough, and
Yeah.
that was part of the frustration. I was like, what? When is it enough? Like I
Yeah.
had amazing wife, I had beautiful, just one baby at the time when I moved into this work. I had, by society's definition, I was doing really well. Like I had great things going for me, thriving little construction business, but I was empty inside because it was never enough, no matter what I did. And I just thought the remedy was dig in deeper, man up, go harder.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
like, I can't even explain the feelings of frustration and emptiness and confusion when you're like, going harder is not the answer here.
Yes. Was there a breaking point for you when you decided something's got to give?
Yeah, well, like I said, I just kept getting like ridiculously run down and just
Yeah.
burning out and like violently ill. One time I got incredibly ill.
Mhm.
And it was really confusing because I came from working in the hospitals to
Mhm.
at the military, then hospitals, and then construction. So I always knew, I had it in the back of my mind, like the importance of health and the importance of taking care of yourself. And I also knew that we can all fall into these patterns of helplessness
Yeah.
after what I saw in the hospital. So I was mindful of it. And I was like, I am literally becoming one of those people. Like I used to see, having attempted suicides in the hospitals like that. I know I'm on that path if I don't do something about this.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so it was just like this incredible awakening. And it ended up I ended up burning out. But thank goodness, like you said, you had a little tap, you had the little whisper of wisdom. You had something inside of you that said, keep going, check this out. And it was, for me, it was just going after a business. And at that business training, I met a mentor and everything changed.
That's so beautiful. And like, and I think that that's a really powerful story because it's also such a real one, right? It's so authentic. It really speaks to how, it starts with self-awareness. And then when you make the decision to just change your life, everything comes together for you. And it's not as romantic as that. Of course, there's just a lot of things that go on. The growth process is also a grieving process, right? Where you're shedding these layers, you're letting go of your like old parts of yourself that are no longer needed to survive, right? Now, as you're getting out of that survival mode and you're getting into this inner child reparenting mode of like growth and self-love, then you're on that path of thriving, right? So if you think of it as on a spectrum, it's like, where do you want to be? Where are you right now? Are you still in survival mode? Are you still running from perceived threats that are actually no longer there anymore? Where that you keep this wounded energy and these wounded beliefs with you, or when you look around you, the world around you, the life that you've created for yourself, are you finally safe? And are you finally able to get your head out of that fog and say, you know what? Now is a great time to start thriving. And I think it is in those moments where something really magical happens, where we're able to truly do the inner work to transform our lives for the better. I had a really painful breakup almost 2 years ago, and it was, and I think I mentioned this on our old call too. It was the start of who Isabella is today. Almost 2 years ago, I was a different kind of person, certainly in executive mode, but I was everything that I thought I should be. I was the socially appropriate executive who took charge and did whatever. But I was also in my mid 20s at the time, so a very young executive trying to find her way through, this corporate role, leading large teams, so much imposter syndrome, you have no idea. And I took on different identities and characteristics in order to thrive in that environment. And when I decided to leave that role to do like my own thing, that was when the real growth happened. And it was so transformative to see who you become when you stop trying to survive and you are mindful of just being present in the space and thriving, because we all have that. We absolutely all have that. And it's a switch of a mindset. And when it comes to you, it'll come, and just take that momentum and run, because this lifetime is not a long time, but we're really lucky. We really are.
I agree. I agree. And yeah, again, I'm just so glad you did step into the work that inspires you, because it's so profound, and we get to sit here and have these powerful conversations as a consequence of you being brave enough to do all that.
I feel the same way about you. You brought this together.
Yeah.
Kudos to that.
Yeah, well, that's it. We both listen to the tab, and that's the opportunity for everyone listening to this. Like, there is, and that word thriving, I love that word thriving. We're meant to thrive. Like, the human body is here to grow, and like anything in nature, we're designed to thrive. And so why would you not do the things that put you in ease as opposed to in dis-ease?
Yes, I agree. I agree. And it's that mindset. Something, I don't know about you, and that's why I love to live my life by quotes, is because there's always something that resonates. It's almost like when you listen to a song when you're really, really sad, and depending on the song, suddenly that, like, the lyrics hit and the melodies hit and the frequency hits your heart, and you're like, whoa, something just clicked, and I feel like me again, or I just don't feel so much pain again. That's kind of like how it is too with, like, the growth process, right? And when you're ready, like, if you're open to receiving these messages, that's kind of the same for anyone too. So going back to your earlier question, what do you like? It was an inner alignment question in terms of, like, what do you suggest to people when they're feeling stuck and they're not aligned? Just find that thing that'll bring you back to who you are, going back to your purpose. And then just find that momentum, find the thing that clicks. Don't stop looking for it until it happens. And when it does, take that momentum and run with it. Yeah.
I love that. I love that. So many questions I want to still ask you. I'm going to be mindful of your time. So one question that I had a conversation with someone recently, and the conversation was around, when you're someone who's doing the work, like, you're really showing up, and you're going into all the dark places, and let's say you've come out of a relationship with someone who was, had really toxic behaviors.
Yeah.
You're there, you're doing all the inner work, but this person who is showing all these toxic traits seems to go on and get a relationship really quickly, and you're left there doing the inner work, and you're looking at this dynamic, and you're like, hang on a minute, how come they're in a relationship and I'm not? How do you kind of, what's a healthy perspective in that scenario?
That's a great question, because prior to this call, I had a very similar conversation with someone around the exact same, very similar thing, not exact. Okay. And I feel like we've all been there. That's a scenario that I certainly resonate with. And it's interesting. I've been single for almost 2 years now. This is the longest I've been single. And in a moment of vulnerability, I will share this. I'm usually very private about my life. An hour before our call, I actually ended something with someone that I was very interested in. And so in terms of doing the inner work and feeling emotionally regulated, we were seeing each other for a few months, and it was on the path of, first off, it was the healthiest thing that I had ever been a part of. And we were doing all of the things, setting healthy boundaries, communicating, community involvement. It was so beautiful. And when we ended, it was a very fascinating thing, because we ended because there were a couple red flags that I was seeing. And it was, we acknowledged it, but we were never able to move forward. So going back to just witnessing, toxic's a strong word, but it could have certainly led there if we allowed it to pursue any longer, right? I was like, hey, this doesn't feel right. We've had a couple conversations. So as hard as it was, we'll, like, part ways. So I don't know what his relationship trajectory will be, but what I was talking about was actually with a coach as well. Before this call, I was explaining to her, she's one of my best friends, this experience, and she's been single for a while now too. And she's like, well, Isabella, when you do the inner work, and other people are not, it can be a really lonely place. And it really, truly can, because you're almost elevating your frequency and you're almost seeing everything from a different perspective. She's like, wouldn't it be easier sometimes if we just didn't know all it takes to, like, identify red flags and to, like, stay in these toxic patterns? And let me tell you, sometimes I think it would be easier if I didn't know what, wounded masculine energy looked like, or wounded feminine energy looks like, or if I didn't know how to understand trauma bonds, right? But going back to your original question is, when you're doing the inner work on yourself, like those external things will still affect you, certainly, but then you're able to rise up and see the bigger picture. Because even though someone may get into a relationship a lot sooner than you afterwards, which certainly doesn't feel good, when you're doing the inner work on yourself, it may take a little bit longer to find yourself in another healthy relationship. But boy, oh boy, when you're finally in that place and you're standing up for yourself and you're not abandoning yourself and you're able to contribute as peers, as equals, it's going to be worth the wait. And all of the work that you put into it to create something that is sustainable, that doesn't just end up in flames. Because the person that isn't doing the inner work essentially, probably is mirroring toxic behaviors, is probably going after the same relationship, but with a different face, right? With a different person. And so that's not sustainable long-term. So anyone who is doing the inner work and feels a little left behind, your time will certainly come, but just be patient with the process.
I love that. Thank you so much for answering that. I want to be mindful of your time, Isabella. Do you need to go off on the hour?
I do not. If you want to keep going, yeah.
Are you okay? We won't go much longer. We'll just jam
I'm still good to go. I cleared out my list, actually. So
okay, amazing. So another question that comes up a lot is around how you could be when you're in a relationship and you really love someone. How come that person, or you can be so easily triggered and frustrated toward that person who you love, like you on that deeper level, you do love them, versus when you're out and about in the world, interacting with people, who are really like less meaningful to you, you can be very calm and collected. And like, how come we can be so charged towards people we loved?
Yeah. So the first thing that comes to mind, it's funny, we talked about all of this before too, an hour ago. So there's a word, it's a really beautiful word. It's called enmeshment. And it's a psychological term that we use. And basically it's how do I say? If we grew up in turbulent homes, right, where there was a lack of boundaries in terms of roles, if I'll give an example for mine, right? My mother is my heart and soul. Till this day, my mom is my best friend. But growing up, there was a lot of enmeshment. So there's a lot of overlap in terms of where her role began, or where her role began and kind of mine ended, right? So there were moments where I basically took on the parenting role of my mother. So enmeshment really refers to the overlap and lack of boundaries and questionable boundaries, right? And so when in intimate relationships or even intimate friendships, right, you'll find that there's a lot of overlap in terms of, our emotions together, the times that we spend together, the amount of information that we share with each other. And with that amount of overlap, because we're extending and sharing our lives with someone so intimately, with that level of vulnerability, we're also exposed, right? And so that's why we find ourselves more easily triggered by those we care about in close relationship, whether it's friends or an intimate partner. It's because there's so much overlap of, where do I begin and where does this person end? And it all becomes a thing. And that's why boundaries are so important, even emotional boundaries, it's something we don't think about, right? We think about financial boundaries, we think about physical boundaries, but when it comes to maintaining healthy relationships, one of the most important things you can do for yourself is to be mindful of all of that overlap and start to then create healthy mental and emotional boundaries for both of you. And yeah, I don't know if that answered the question.
That does. Yeah. I think that's great. And so an emotional barrier, would that look like, I don't like it when you make me feel this way? I know that's strange to say that because no one can ever really make you feel something. It's inside you. But is that, when you say emotional barriers, is that what that looks like for you?
Yeah. So a couple things, and I know this is minor, but I know you'll appreciate it just from a lot of NLP work, right?
Yep.
So instead of barrier, because barrier in my mind, and everyone's different, it has this connotation of here's the line in the sand and I'm going to keep you out and I'm going to stay here, right? So the word boundary is really beautiful because it's actually not meant to keep people out or in. It's actually meant to create like closeness if done right. And that's really the purpose of a boundary. It's how do I give myself to you without depleting everything that I have? It's the difference between giving my all versus giving everything. Does that make sense? And that's the way that I describe boundaries. It's the difference between giving my all to something versus giving everything. When you give your all, you're trying your hardest. That is intrinsically motivated, right? And no one can take that away from you, that level of satisfaction, right? But when you give your all, you deplete and you deplete. And that's what we find with relationships, even with our relationships with like our children, right? Or like even with our work. And so it's a healthy mindset there. But going back to your question, so mind you, this last relationship that I was in, I was going into it very consciously. It was very beautiful. So I'll just use myself as an example in terms of what a healthy boundary looked like. And so in the past, going back, so not to get too nerdy about the psychology, but attachment styles, right? Like super important. There's anxious attachment where it's like, give me attention, or there's like fearful avoidant attachment, which is like, I want to get close to you, but not too close. So to anyone, I'm going to back up a little bit. To anyone that doesn't know James Bowlby's work around attachment styles, there are 4 of them. And in summary, they're just learned behaviors from childhood in order to get our needs met. Now, if we're not mindful of our attachment styles, we will show unhealthy patterns show up in our relationships. And not just our relationships, even our relationship to money or possessions or experiences, right? And it's just such a great indicator of where you've been, but also where your relationship is going if you are not mindful of your attachment styles. Mm-hmm. And so in the past, if I really liked someone, I led with a little bit more anxious attachment. So I've done a lot of inner work to lead with more secure. And so something that I used to do in the past was, goodness gracious, God forbid we were ever apart for more than a day. It's like, no, I want to be with you all the time. Let's like do everything together, right? And we were just basically living on top of each other, very forgetful of our goals or our family or our friends, right? And that's too much of that is not healthy, right? Mm-hmm. Everything in moderation, even moderation. And so, I like that. So with this new relationship, I went into it saying, what is your purpose in life? What are your goals? Because I wanted to know his big picture goals outside of me. And then he asked the same question in return. And I expressed my goals. And I said, okay, leading with a abundance mindset versus a scarcity mindset. If we are meant to be, our paths will align and we will see each other. So like, we don't need to get all of our time in this one moment, but let's make sure that every interaction that we have is a healthy one. That even in our time apart, like, let's make sure that we're focused on our goals and committed to those things, because why else are we in this together, right? I want to help you grow and I would hope for the same in return. And it's a really beautiful way that we started, because that's the way that we set healthy boundaries. So whereas I was the person before that would overextend and I was like, I need to see you, or if you said jump, I would say how high. Now instead we say, these are our goals. This is our schedule for the week. Let's make sure that we at least say, we say goodnight to each other over FaceTime, and we'll see each other when we see each other. And it was a very healthy boundary, because it allowed us to be in our own space, completely emotionally regulated, but knowing that we had secure attachment with one another. Mm-hmm. And there's a really beautiful quote in terms of even boundaries, but it says, when you feel safe together, you feel safe apart. And there are 2 components of creating emotional safety. And the 2 components are attachment and esteem. So if you think about both of those things, attachment is basically like, how close is Nash and I? Like, how close are we, right? And then esteem is like, oh, I hope, how highly does Nash think of me, right? And with those 2 components, if they're elevated at like a higher level, it's like, cool, Nash thinks I'm a good person and he like wants to hang with me. Great, I feel secure, right? So that when we create that safety in our relationships, we then can create secure boundaries and secure attachment styles, which allows just for life to open up, really.
I
So
love that.
that
That's
was a
beautiful.
whole robust thing of stuff. So let me
I
know if
know. That was so good. I was like in that. I was like, "Ooh, this is good."
let me know about the ones.
No, that was beautiful. Thank you so much. And I can't wait to read your book where you're going to go into all this on a deeper level. Um, Second last question for you, if that's all right. It's about being more in your feminine, and this kind of touches on what we were speaking about before. But this particular scenario, a mother who, say, for example, single mum, um, with young men to
Mm-hmm.
raise,
Mm-hmm.
because I know this is a scenario I've come across a few times.
Yeah.
How does that incredible powerhouse of a woman who's in that role access or make sure she's tapping into her feminine so she draws a man into her life, which
Mm-hmm.
is what she wants, who's in his masculine when she's having to be so much in her masculine, if that makes sense. Like she's having to take care of the household and like all the components associated with that, as well as show up for her boys. Like, does that question or the scenario make sense?
Yeah, that makes total sense. And I love that you asked that because especially with this day and age too, with a lot of like super empowered females out there,
Mm.
right? And so it's an interesting thing where first off, we talk about masculine or toxic masculinity, but something that we don't touch on, which is interestingly taboo, is to mention the concept around toxic femininity, which is equally as bad, right? So that's why balancing both your masculine and feminine energies, which, as you know, we all have, right? But with the concept around masculine and feminine energies, there's a basically like there's an energy that we use as our more dominant energy. So for mine, it's feminine. But for other people, even a woman could naturally lead with masculine energy. But in this context, it sounds like this woman wants to be more in her feminine. It sounds like it must be her more natural state. So what I would do if I were coaching her is I would understand the different ways in which she's showing up in her masculine, whether it's secure masculine energy or it is wounded masculine energy. So secure masculine energy could look like, holding space. It could look like being protective, right? It could look like setting structure and being decisive and disciplined. All things this single mother would need to be in order to manage 3 little boys, right? So those are healthy, secure, masculine traits, things that she needs in order to be the best that she can be for her little boys and for herself in this environment. Then I would look at her wounded masculine energy and where that's showing up. And some examples of wounded masculine energy is being overly competitive, right? It could look like possessiveness. It could look like control, like extreme control, right? So any maladaptive behaviors like that. So then I would ask her to look, like really just do a self-assessment of all the ways that she's showing up securely in her masculine and in her feminine. And then all the ways that she's showing up in wounded ways in her masculine and her feminine, because we need a starting place, right? So guys, it goes back to self-awareness. Take inventory of everything, because what gets measured, what's the quote? What gets measured gets improved or something.
Yes.
Something like that. So it starts with understanding these meaningful metrics to begin with, because that's our starting point. So if I were coaching her, I would go through and I would understand her different energies. And then I would understand too, her environment. Because unless her environment changes in some capacity, or her mindset around her environment changes in some capacity, she will find change to be extraordinarily difficult, right? And so it's understanding how we can get her back into that feminine state. And what we know about healthy feminine energy is that it's free flowing, right? It's meant to be nurturing. It's meant to be warm. It's meant to basically be that creative space. And that can be a difficult place to fall into when you're trying to be protective of these 3 boys and all of those things. So finding that balance. And if you think of it on a spectrum, that's essentially what I would do. So I would figure out the polarities, and it's hard to see because for your listeners, obviously we're recording this, that I would figure out if she is in a super protective, helicopter mom state, right? So decisive, masculine, structured state. It's like, okay, that is one polarity. On the flip side of that, to create healthy feminine energy on the spectrum here, how do we migrate that just a little bit? Does that look like vulnerability? Maybe it's putting on something nice, like a beautiful perfume or like a dress that she likes to wear. Maybe it's a certain shade of lipstick that just brings her back into that flow. But I think for a lot of women, and this is a generalizing statement, but one that I do feel safe saying, I think for a lot of women, when they find themselves in their masculine energy, it's because they're trying to protect theirs. And so it's in a way of, it's their way of stoicism, right? But could potentially become maladaptive. And it is their way of basically becoming that protective force for themselves and for others, because they don't feel like they have people that they can lean on. So I would look at communal support. What is a safe masculine energy that you can lean on to balance out your feminine energy? I know for me, sometimes after a long day, especially because I'm, my clients are all like high intensity, aggressive performing men. I have to show up. Certainly this is not my masculine. I have to show up in full blown Isabella masculine, especially when I'm calling them out on their shit. And I can feel extraordinarily depleted at the end of the day. So what do? I'll do all the things. Maybe I'll light a candle. I'll play a little song. And to balance out my energies, I'm fortunate that I have very secure male friends that are strictly friends that can balance out my energy, where they can take the lead, that I can safely lean on. So all the things.
That's so gold. Thank you so much for diving into all that. Like I said, I could talk to you for hours, Isabella. So this is so much appreciated. How can people get in contact with you and find out more about your work?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I'm not posting a ton on social media right now. It's really fascinating too. I mean, that goes back to, and I'm sure everyone's seen it on Netflix. Have you seen that Netflix special around, what is it, The Social Dilemma?
No, I haven't.
So, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's probably nothing you don't already know in terms of social media. Whatever. I just am not a big fan of social media. Like, I'm rarely on it, but I certainly do check DMs, because that's certainly one way to get in touch with me. So it's the Imani movement, I think or Isabella Imani.
Yes.
DMs work really great. And I think also you can just shoot me an email through there. And that's one of the best ways for us to get in contact.
That's perfect. Do you have a website currently?
I do, and that's also on my Instagram. So everything I think anyone needs is easily found on my Instagram, and I'm pretty quick to respond back.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And your Instagram's fantastic, by the way, like heaps of great quotes on there, and people get to get a feel for who you are as a person. And I thoroughly enjoyed going through some of your highlights and seeing, getting to know you. I was like, oh, this is awesome. So that you get a real feel for who you are as a person and as a coach as well. So Instagram's a great place. So Isabella, the last question I've got for you is, if you got a call from Mark Zuckerberg or the high powers that be who run the big social media sites, and they said, Isabella, we've picked one person, and that person's you, to share a message with the world. You've got 1 minute.
Oh boy.
Before we delete social media. It's gone forever.
Yeah.
What would be the message that you would share in this moment?
Oh, wow. That's a beautiful question. I think I'm just going to go with the thing that is top of mind to me. And the first thing that I would say is the importance of inner healing. It's something that I am such a huge advocate for. The importance of healing from our emotional wounds in particular. It's something where I'm drafting up a TED Talk where I talk about the compounding effects of not healing from these emotional wounds, right? So if we're bullied at a young age, essentially the statistical compounding effects even of bullying, and how, hurt people and how that gets transferred. And so essentially what I would say is, I would talk about the importance of healing from our inner wounds so we can closer connect. And humans are wired for human connection. Like, that's what we want. We all just want to feel love and belonging. But unless we're able to heal from our inner wounds, we will always be operating from a fear-based perspective. And when we have this fear, it doesn't bring us closer together. It drives us further apart. And I think that that's the exact outcome that people don't want. And when you think about this lifetime, and I said this before, a lifetime is truly not a long time. So think about the people that you love, that you want to embrace this world with without fear, right? Because you've done the inner work, you're healing. And think about the opportunities that you really want to take on, but you haven't done the inner work to heal from like the pain of the past, right? So it all starts with the healing process within you, because truly once you do that, I promise you the world will absolutely open up and you will reach this place of just happiness. And it's not because of any one person, place, or thing. It's because you truly knew how to develop it within yourself. And that's what brings us here to be able to do the work that we're doing today. So, okay, I think that was 1 minute. That was
I love that.
That's all I got.
That was awesome. Thank you so much, Isabella. It's been an absolute privilege to connect with you. And thank you so much for everything you're doing in the world, and just keep showing up and shining that light. All right.
You as well. I'm going to stalk you on social media. You are doing incredible work. I can't wait to see more of it.
Thank you so much, Isabella. I appreciate you.
Of course. Have a good rest of your night.